Pneumonia by Carly Ball and Gillian Mahatchett. John is a 27-year-old male. He came into the clinic complaining of a fever and shortness of breath during his activities of daily living. Upon auscultation, the nurse practitioner at the clinic noted that John had crackling sounds throughout his lungs. Consequently, she sent him for a chest x-ray. Upon examining the x-ray results, the nurse practitioner was able to observe white areas of opacities. John was diagnosed with bacterial pneumonia. First off, you may be asking, what is pneumonia? Simply put, pneumonia is an acute infection of the lower respiratory tract that is associated with inflammation of the alveoli and bronchioles, resulting in fluid buildup and impaired gas exchange. To understand pneumonia further in depth, we must first understand the normal physiology of the lungs. Air will enter the lungs during inspiration. On its journey, it will travel through the nostril and nasal cavity, or the mouth, to the pharynx, then to the larynx, and then to the trachea. The trachea divides into two parts to give rise to the left and right bronchi. After bronchi undergo multiple subdivisions, the air will finally hit the alveoli. Microbes in the air enter the lungs along with the oxygen. The air passages have several defense mechanisms to prevent infections. The trachea is lined with stratostratified epithelium, which secretes mucus to trap any foreign particles, such as dust or bacteria. It is also lined with cilia, which carries the foreign particles that are trapped in the mucus out of the airway. As you get farther down the lungs, closer to the alveoli, there are fewer goblet cells and cilia, and once you reach the alveoli, there are no goblet cells or cilia. Within the lungs are immune cells that fight off invaders and repair the lungs. Immune cells such as dendritic cells, mast cells, and innate lymphoid cells. When inhaled, antigens come in contact with the epithelium. They initiate the release of chemicals which go into the lymph system to stimulate the release of T cells. Alveolar macrophages, a type of immune cell, destroy bacteria by engulfing them and by releasing cytokines to communicate with dendritic cells and lymphocytes in the lungs, causing inflammation. As previously discussed, the purpose of inhalation is to bring air in, particularly oxygen, so our cells can undergo cellular respiration. The used O2 will be converted into CO2, which acts as a waste in our bodies. However, it does have a functional use. Through a series of mechanisms, CO2 actually helps regulate blood pH and keep it within homeostatic levels. Normally, arterial blood has a pH of about 7.41, and venous blood has a pH of about 7.36. Naturally, the alveoli are mostly composed of type 1 alveolar cells, which are simple squamous cells fused to a flimsy basement membrane. Type 2 alveolar cells are simple cuboidal cells that secrete surfactant. Surfactant is a phospholipid protein that lines the surface of the alveoli and also prevents alveoli from collapsing during expiration. The capillaries, which run through the walls of the alveoli, are also only one cell thick and fused to the alveoli via the respiratory membrane. At the alveoli, external respiration occurs. This means that some CO2, represented by the red squares, will diffuse from the blood into the alveoli, and some O2, represented by the blue squares, will do the opposite. Both of these processes are passive and occur through simple diffusion as a result of partial pressures. Pneumonia usually impairs external respiration because the alveoli are filled with fluid. This occurs because our body's immune responses. In typical pneumonias, bacteria grows within the alveoli. White blood cells, including macrophages and neutrophils, will phagocytize the bacteria and die. They will stain the alveoli and add to fluid buildup. Additionally, inflammation will be triggered, causing vasodilation and increased capillary permeability. Therefore, fluid from the nearby capillaries, such as red and white blood cells, will enter the alveoli. This fluid builds up, making more dead space in the alveoli. Because of this dead space, less O2 can enter the lungs. As a result of the increased fluid in the alveoli, there is reduced functional area to allow for gas exchanges because of the increased amount of dead space. CO2, the red squares, will continue in the bloodstream, and O2, the blue squares, will exit the alveoli and not be taken into the bloodstream. Because of this, a symptom of pneumonia is shortness of breath. Other symptoms of pneumonia may include chest pain because of decreased elasticity of the lungs and more work due to increased respirations, cough as a mechanism to spit up some of the fluid, and fever, which is another immune response to bacterial infections. Pneumonia affects the three key concepts. It affects homeostasis by altering blood pH. Because CO2 has difficulty leaving the body, hypercapnia or too much carbon dioxide in the body may occur. This condition may lead to a decrease in blood pH or blood acidosis. On the other hand, pneumonia can cause too much carbon dioxide to leave the body because the infected individual's increased respiration, causing the blood pH to increase, or blood alkalosis. Secondly, pneumonia decreases oxygen levels in the body. Oxygen is unable to reach the capillaries and is exhaled out. This condition is known as hypoxia. And lastly, pneumonia raises the body temperature out of homeostatic levels to try to fight off the infection. Pneumonia also affects proteins. The surfactant that surrounds the alveoli is made up of phospholipids and proteins. Upon infection, the proteins that make up the surfactant can become denatured by bacteria, making them less effective at preventing collapse of the alveoli. As a result, there is fewer functioning alveoli and much more energy is required for inspiration. Also, the inflammatory response that occurs in the alveoli during pneumonia is brought on by various proteins such as histamine, kinins, prostaglandins, etc. All of these proteins promote local arterial dilation and leaky capillaries. And finally, pneumonia affects the cell walls by impairing diffusion across it. As a result of the fluid buildup in the alveoli, the distance that the gas must move in order to cross the membrane between the alveoli and the bloodstream is much greater. This distance becomes too great for diffusion, and therefore the gases are not being passed between the lungs and the blood. And finally, not to leave John out, after taking all of his prescribed antibiotics, he made a full recovery.